What's going on? Jake here with Uncommon EDC. Today we're going to be taking a look at the CJRB Maximal. This knife recently released, but it was a pretty highly anticipated release, designed by David C. Anderson, who you may recognize as the face of Knife Center's YouTube channel, or even from some of his previous knife designs. Now, the knife itself is a fairly budget-friendly model, and that's going to be an important talking point as we dive deeper into this video. But before we do that, we have to define what budget-friendly is, because everyone's opinion is a little bit different on that. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to define it as sub $50, and that's a pretty universal kind of budget line where it's the top of the threshold for a lot of people that still find it to be budget-friendly, and so kind of a perfect starting point for that conversation. And both of the configurations you see here, Micarta scales on the top, G10 scales on the bottom, come in at $49.99, so just underneath that threshold. They do offer a Knife Center exclusive version with upgraded steel, carbon fiber on those scales, and of course that comes with a bump in price up to $70, which I still think is in that budget realm, sub $75. But again, everyone's opinion there is going to differ a little bit, so I'll leave links to both options down in the description of the video. Now, the reason price point is such an important part of the conversation around this knife comes down to the design inspiration itself. So when designing a knife, there's a lot of starting points you can start with. Maybe you have a specific task in mind, you want to be able to do utility cuts, or maybe you have a certain feature in mind like a thumb hole or a button lock or anything like that, blade shape. Or maybe even you're starting with a visual aesthetic that you're trying to achieve, something you saw in nature you want to kind of follow the curves of. Or other companies may try to design the most affordable knife that's still a viable option for a daily carry. And that's not exactly what this is either. If it were, you would see something with a little bit more affordable steel than AR RPM 9, and maybe you'd compromise on the handle materials and swap them for G10 down to like FRN or GFN, one of those more plasticky, flimsy materials, and be able to get the price point down a little bit lower. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not what they were trying to achieve here either. The design inspiration on this one started with a question, and the question was, what's the best all-around knife that you can get for $50 or less? And so when designing the knife, you want to design the answer to that. What's the best knife I can design for under $50? And keeping that in mind, you can kind of see why a lot of the choices that were made. So things like the blade shape, which is a drop point style blade, arguably the most common blade shape that you're going to find. And so for a lot of knife enthusiasts, people with dozens of knives or sometimes even hundreds of knives, they get pretty tired of drop point style blades. And so why would you want that on an all-around knife? And the answer comes in the other types of blade shapes that are maybe more popular. I think if you were to poll the general population, drop point's probably the most popular, so it automatically makes sense there. But the other kind of options that are near the top, something like a Warncliffe style blade or a clip point style blade if you're more into traditional knives, or really any of these other blade shapes, as many people that like those, there's also an equal number of people, or close to equal number of people, that dislike them. And I'd say with some blade shapes like a hawkbill, for example, there's probably more people that dislike them than like them. And so it doesn't make sense to choose one of those, even if they were to come out as the more popular blade shape that more people liked, because there's also a ton of people that dislike them. The thing that you get with drop point is people pretty much universally agree that it's just a great general blade shape, and you're not going to find on the bottom of people's lists of least favorite blade shapes. It's going to be in the top 3 of pretty much everyone's list. And so if you take that kind of aggregate, you know that you're going to be appealing to the widest number of people. So drop point does make a lot of sense. Now, that being said, it's not the exact conventional drop point shape. It's got a little bit of a lower tip than you find on them, and that's because of the steep drop that you see here. A lot of times you'll see a little more subtle drop where the tip lands a little bit higher. And what that means is that we still get a great tip on here, but it elongates that belly. So maybe it's a little bit less pronounced looking, where if the tip was a little bit higher, you'd see it kind of curve up a little bit more, but you get a longer, more usable belly out of it. So I do like that blade shape quite a bit. Now, that does make a lot of people draw comparisons between this and the Griptilian, or mini Griptilian has a similar drop. And that one's actually a little bit steeper. This is almost a hybrid between the mini grip and a Sebenza drop point, which has a little bit more of a flat before that steep drop off. But either way, I really dig the blade shape, and I think it was a great choice for this knife. Now, another area that should be pretty obvious when designing an all-around knife is the blade length. You want something pretty mid-sized, not so small that it's going to feel tiny in your hands, but also not cumbersome and large for people that are just daily carrying it in office. And so I think a universal blade shape would probably be between 7¼ to 7½ inches for a mid-sized knife. This one actually comes in a little bit smaller, 6.89 inches. And again, that comes back to the question of all-around knife. And so the reason this one's a little bit shorter than probably what's the average that people are looking for is the blade length is 2.95 inches. And that keeps it legal in all 50 states here in the US. There's states like New York and I think a couple others that have 3-inch blade limits. I know LA County does, but the rest of California doesn't. And so under 3 inches on the blade length, meaning that you don't have to have that asterisk in your description. So if someone asks, what's the best all-around knife under $50, you don't have to say, you know, it's a Maximal unless you live in New York here or here, because those, it's not legal, and then you have to come up with a different knife. Keeps it universal, and so kind of a smart decision there. That does mean that keeping the handle length ratio kind of equal, we do get a shorter handle than I think would be with a 7¼ to 7½ inch long knife. We get 3.94 inches on the handle. For me, that offers about a 3½ finger grip. So my pinky is on there, but it's kind of in danger of falling off. So if you have really large hands, you may be a 3-finger grip on this, but it's a very, very comfortable 3½ finger grip, I'd say. No hot spots whatsoever. And I can creep up onto the flat under the pivot here. This is one of the few knives where I feel like it doesn't feel like a super natural position for me. And although I can get all 4 fingers on here now, I do prefer the further back grip on this particular knife. And I think a big part of that is the handle design. So if we take a look at the handle, another thing that if you're trying to design an all-around knife, it has to be pretty neutral. You can't make any wild stylistic choices or really force the grip. You can see we have one kind of groove here for your finger, and otherwise pretty flat, neutral grip on here. But along the spine, where we typically would see this kind of follow the same angle all the way across, there's a drop here and it kind of swoops down, and it just makes a really great landing spot for your thumb. So there's no jimping or anything of the sort there, but it just feels like a really natural gripping point there. So that's why I prefer the further back grip on this knife. Even though if you've watched some of my other videos, you know I like to be right up behind that blade. For this one, it just feels a little bit more natural further back. And so we have G10 on the scales. There are steel liners in here. Both of them kept the weight down pretty well. This G10 version is 3 ounces on the dot. The Micarta version is a little bit lighter. I weighed this one in at 2.82 ounces, which is something CJRB does really well. They matched my scale exactly. Typically, when I get a weight off of a website, when I weigh it myself, it's either, you know, a little bit lighter, a little bit heavier. It's almost never the exact weight, but both of these were the exact weight that they said on the website, which is kind of cool. Now, as far as the micarta finishing on this goes, really well done. I like the feeling of that soft fuzzy micarta, but I do think this really tightly pressed and polished micarta just looks better and more well finished, and so love the look of that. You also have a black G10 option on top of that, and so if you prefer black G10, that is an option as well. So you do get a couple options in these base configurations. We also have a deep carry pocket clip, kind of neutrally located right there in the center, so it doesn't create a hot spot on your knuckles, and that is reversible. I do wish that was set into the handle instead of just sitting on the top. As you can see, just kind of a catching point when you're sliding it into your pocket when it sits on the top like that. With or without a plug, I just prefer when it's set into the handle. So kind of one little minor gripe when it comes to the pocket clip, but otherwise super, super solid. We also have a lanyard hole back here as well. Now, probably one of the best parts about this is this crossbar lock. And so you may or may not be a fan of crossbar locks, but it's a great lock because it's ambidextrous. This has the exact same experience left-handed or right-handed once you swap that pocket clip. So fully ambidextrous. But if you've ever had a crossbar lock, you've probably experienced what feels like a mushy detent. Now, crossbars don't have a detent. It's all spring tension, but this one has a very heavy spring tension, which is a very, very good thing. When you flick this one open, it doesn't feel like you're flicking open a crossbar. It feels like it has a detent, and it feels like it has a super snappy action. It's a lot of fun to fidget with, a lot of fun to flick open, and it flicks open with authority without that mushy feeling that you typically get with a crossbar lock. So really well executed. Now, that does mean you have to pull the lock back just a little bit harder, but it's not a super noticeable thing. I mean, I guess it is, but it's very comfortable to do. The crossbar lock itself is very non-offensive. It doesn't grab onto your fingers super tightly or anything, so it's not an uncomfortable thing to have to pull it just a little bit harder. Feels great overall in my opinion, and that's probably my favorite part about how that was executed. So not only is the knife very neutral, I think a majority of people are going to like it, which is exactly what he was trying to achieve, but the action on it's great, and it's just a pleasure to flick open and close. I love that blade shape. Like I said, it's just a drop point blade, but just a subtle change to just make it a little bit better than your standard drop point. So I think he did a really great job of appealing to those masses. And so if you were to ask me, you know, did he design the best all-around knife for under $50? The answer is kind of complicated, so I think the answer is probably. And the reason I say that is because if you're a knife enthusiast, if you have 1,000 knives, it may not be as exciting, but I think this is a great entry knife if you're just getting into knives. I do think it's a great all-around knife, but we all have our own biases and preferences, and so everyone's best all-around knife is going to be a little bit different, because maybe for you a crossbar is like a non-starter and no best all-around knife can have a crossbar style lock, or maybe you just can't stand drop point style blades or something like that. I don't know, there's all the kinds of different things, or maybe it just doesn't fit your hand perfectly, although it is a very, very neutral hand shape on that handle. But there's a lot of things that can make it not the best all-around knife for you, but I think for the general population, he did a pretty good job of answering every question that you might get when designing a knife to be an all-around knife. And I think it's just a really great option, whether it's your first knife or your 20th knife, whatever the case may be. I don't think you'll be disappointed with this knife. I think there's maybe better knives for certain jobs. If you work in a role like roofing or in the military and you need a self-defense knife, this isn't that, but it's a great utility knife. It's great for chopping food, great for general use, great for most of the things that you're going to be doing. Unless you have a very specific use, I think you'll have a hard time finding a better knife for you in the price point. The only, again, caveat for me might be that maybe you ramp it up a little bit in size to a 7 1/4, 7.5 inch knife, and that would be preferable. But again, that excludes certain states and things like that, so I understand why he made the decision that he made. But overall, really, really cool knife. I was super impressed with it. Really well finished, everything about it. AR RPM 9 on the steel, which I mentioned very briefly in the beginning, but is a great steel. It's an in-house steel for CJRB and Artisan Cutlery, and so is a great steel. Love how the micarta in particular were finished. If I were to choose one of these, I'd probably choose the micarta, although I absolutely love the shade of red that we got on our G10. But let me know what you think down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, joining the channel as a member. As always, I'll make sure to link to both of these down in the description if you're interested in picking them up, and I hope you have a great one. Take care.